Welcome to Teachers Lounge. Today we're with Deonte Bridges, teacher at Atlanta Heights Charter Academy. And Deonte is somebody that I've wanted to talk to for a while because I think he's doing some really cool things in his classroom when it comes to creating relationships with the students, having a relationship that goes deeper than just the teacher-student level. So thank you, Deonte, for being on. Teachers, I think, get into this profession to make a difference in their community, make a difference in the schools around them, make a difference for our future. And it's something very commendable. I think it's something that not a lot of professions have. You know, you don't get into accounting to make a huge difference in your community. I guess my first question is, what originally made you want to be a teacher?
I've always, even as a child, I've always had a passion for community, serving the community. And I think as I navigated through school, especially high school, and I reached my senior year, and of course the question arises, what are your plans? What do you plan to study? And at the time, I honestly didn't have a sense of direction in regards to what I wanted to study once I transitioned to college. So I started off at the University of Georgia, taking up business, only because I still didn't have an idea of what I wanted to do. And then I transferred to Morehouse College. And upon transferring, I think that's when I started to realize just how much I wanted to, of course, remain at home in the community that reared me and just give back. So Morehouse did not offer an education program, but they did offer sociology. And the only reason why I took up sociology is because I had to take it as an elective my first year there. And just learning about how systems work and doing a little research and finding out that Martin Luther King Jr. actually studied and earned his degree in sociology as well. And I had a lot of great professors, and I just decided to roll with it. And it was the influence of those educators, as well as those educators that I had throughout my K through 12 experience. Their influence inspired me to get back into the community to teach.
That's the one thing about teachers that you hear over and over, whether you do blogs or podcasts or videos with teachers. I'm not a teacher, but we create a lot of content for teachers. That seems to be the most popular answer about why you got into teaching was I had a great teacher in 5th grade or 6th grade or high school or college that, I really connected with. And, talking with you before this and, kind of leading up to this, that's something that you are doing in your classroom as well, connecting with these students and really connecting with that environment. I think, any teacher will tell you creating relationships is the most important part of the learning process. I had a teacher one time tell me, if you don't have relationships with your students more than just the surface level, don't expect them to learn anything. And I think that's true. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you was different teachers I've talked to have told me, creating relationships in one school is different than creating relationships with other schools. Schools in farm country is different than inner city schools, or, private schools are different. Atlanta Heights, I think it's, safe to say, is characterized as an urban environment. Is that an area when you started teaching that you wanted to be in?
Absolutely, 100%, because it's home for me. So my high school, as well as my college, is maybe 10 minutes away from Atlanta Heights Charter School. So in a good radius, it's the community that I grew up in, and it makes it even more special and meaningful. But it's definitely an urban environment, one that is plagued by some of those detrimental factors that we often associate with urban environments, but at the same time, full of so much purpose and promise and potential. And, that's what I want to do, try to do my part in cultivating that potential and just that promise that I see in those scholars. Because at one point in time, I was that student, and those teachers saw something in me and invested their time, energy, and resources. So I think it's only right that I do the same thing.
That's very commendable. Now, the one thing that I think is interesting is a lot of teachers want to make that difference. I've talked to a number of teachers that weren't from an urban environment, but really wanted to make a difference. So they, took a job at an urban school or an urban environment, and they found it difficult to start creating relationships with these kids. How are you able to connect with these kids, create relationships with them, to foster an environment that encourages this learning that is so important?
First and foremost, being authentic. Of course, I believe coming from that environment, being able to relate to them in more ways than one helps a lot. But even outside of that, there are other educators who are also from similar neighborhoods who still struggle with building relationships with their scholars. But I believe it's all about being authentic. Those scholars they can read through you, read directly through you. And just being authentic, truly, I know it sounds cliche, but truly meeting them where they are and taking the time to truly get to know them beyond the surface level, see what their interests are, the things that they're passionate about. And it requires patience. It requires a great deal of patience because some of these students are subjected to so much and have experienced so much trauma. And, or I can think of many scholars who've, had to struggle and deal with just being abandoned, for an example, and having people leave and walk out of their lives, even educators. So, and that's what my experience was. A sad case, but a blessing in disguise, honestly, because that's how I was able to get into the profession.
It's interesting you use the word authentic, because you're right. I think it does sound cliche. I mean, go on any teacher's Instagram account and you'll see, be authentic, all of these same monikers that we see over and over. But what to you does that mean to connect with your students, to be authentic, because you hear a lot of different times teachers will have like Good News Friday, or tell me about your pet or your dad's birthday or whatever. But for you and your students, what does being authentic mean?
When I think about being authentic, I tell my students all the time, and I use a quote by Shakespeare: "So thine own self be true." I really want them to embrace their true identities, and in doing so, and advocating for them to do so, or encouraging them to do so, rather, I try to make sure that I do the exact same thing and model being authentic, letting them know that it's okay not to have a good day, or, hey, you may not be at 100% today, but if you have 70%, give 70% of what you have. Give all of that 70%. And just showing up and understanding that I use an analogy of a puzzle all the time. Each puzzle piece contributes to the bigger picture, or to the bigger idea. And I tell them all the time, the only way that you truly fit into the puzzle is by standing out. And by standing out and being your authentic self, I think we all have so much to offer, have so much to bring to the table. And in doing that and in promoting authenticity, it helps me to create that safe space for my students. And it extends beyond the four walls of the classroom. Even prior to getting on the call with you today, maybe 20 minutes prior to getting on this call, my phone randomly started ringing, and it was one of my scholars from 2 years ago calling, just randomly FaceTiming me, just to chat and to catch up and tell me about life. And I think, that's where the beauty lies and the true impact lies. Beyond just day-to-day interactions in the hallway and fist bumps and high fives and stickers on doing a good job and having your work posted, really being able to be invested into their lives and just be a resource for them to use and rely on.
And it's really cool to kind of see this picture after the fact. Your student calls you from 2 years ago. As a new teacher, though, is this something that takes time to build these authentic relationships? Because you're building them at a level that's not what's your favorite color. I mean, I can honestly say I've never called a teacher of mine 2 years after the fact to say, what's up? This is what's going on with me.
It's something that you absolutely cannot force, or else it'll backfire you 100%. So that goes back to being patient and just trusting the process. It takes time for a lot of them to open up. And you just have to trust the process and not force it. Just make yourself available and it happens at different rates. So you may be able to build a relationship with this group of students quicker than you may with this particular group. I definitely say it's all about being patient and not forcing it, and just being intentional about setting out time to make yourself available and carving out time to just get to know the students. Sometimes you have to just step away from the curriculum, step away from the textbooks, and truly have conversations. I think my messages often resonate, and they always come back and tell me, man, I appreciate what you told me, Mr. Bridges. It definitely helped. And honestly, that was the kind of the essence of the conversation that I just had with one of my former scholars a minute ago. Just navigating high school now, and him just thanking me for the ways that I assisted him when he finished up middle school, because he found himself kind of at a crossroads and getting into some trouble. And, he actually ran away from home, and his siblings tried reaching out to me, and they asked if I could come and help. And I want to say it was probably 11 o'clock, almost midnight. And I was out with the police trying to find him. And, he didn't want to go home. And I'm just thinking about that interaction with him, sitting outside for more than 2 hours, him eventually taking heed to everything that I had to say. That's what it's all about.
The one thing that I think may get overlooked sometimes, or teachers in an urban environment don't get enough credit for, is, and everybody talks about educating the whole student, right? It's on t-shirts, it's on class signs, educate the whole student. But you are doing that. You are, when somebody calls at 11 o'clock to come help, enlist your help to come find one of your former students, or just being there for a kid that had you 2 years ago to call you. Is that draining on a teacher? Is that something that you are constantly thinking about? Because teachers always talk about, I think about my kids every day, and that's, you hear that all the time. Your brain never shuts off as a teacher. But when you're dealing with these types of issues, is that something that can be tough on you as well?
It's deeper for me because I'm not that far removed from where they're currently positioned. And I think about my experiences. And if we as a collective, meaning my peers, had more educators like the ones that I was fortunate enough to have. So although we went to the same schools, we had different experiences with our educators and our teachers. And many of my friends, they definitely fell by the wayside. And I try not to think about it because many of them are no longer here. Many of them are locked behind bars or just living a life that isn't rooted in the potential that I knew that they had at the time. And many of them are living with regrets. And I think if they had an educator who was invested into them the way that mine were invested into me and the way that I'm invested into my students, I think it would have truly made a difference, because I know that I'm doing something right. If they feel comfortable enough to reach out to me or lean on me in times of need, or even in moments when they just want to share their success. If there's absolutely nothing going on at all, and they just want to call and talk about sports or gossip about their little boyfriends and girlfriends and give advice, it's a beautiful thing. And I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.
This is the exact reason why I wanted to talk to you about this subject.
If you continue to do right by those students and continue to have the best interest at heart and remain genuine and sincere and make yourself available and be patient, I think those are a few of the ingredients that I believe, when you put them all together, you'll be setting yourself up to be successful in that regard, in regards to building those relationships.
How important is that patience?
Very, 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 very important. Very important. My first year, my patience, again, this is my first year teaching. I have my educators as examples, but I was a great student. I wasn't a behavior problem in school. So of course I made it easier for them. So when I had those students who, would give me issues or give me a little trouble, trying to figure out how to navigate that, In the very beginning, I struggled. It took for me having to realize that I can't take how they react or how they're behaving. I can't take it personal. And then not taking it personal, you can't take these things on a personal level. These kids are going through so much, and sometimes they show up, and you have to be on the receiving end of it. But I think in those moments, you kind of have to just understand that it's bigger than you. It's bigger than that child in that moment, and you have to find unique ways to communicate. It's all about communication too, knowing how to be patient in how you interact with them, but also how you communicate with them. And of course, communication is an extension of just that interaction. And when you're able to talk to them and not yell and fuss and be combative and take offense to whatever they say, they realize, like, man, I can trust you. And I've found myself in situations when I've been approached by some of my scholars who, they let me have it, and I didn't do anything to them. I could not allow myself to take it personal, and that made all the difference.
So, with the not taking it personal in mind, how much do you think? And this might be an impossible question to answer, but these, whether it's a behavioral issue or not caring in the classroom or, fighting, outbursts, whatever, even being combative with you, like you said, how much of that do you think is a reflection of what they're dealing with outside of school and really has nothing to do with you personally?
Yeah, so there's no concrete answer, but I know for sure it has a whole lot to do with it. A very large percentage of it, I'm sure, has a lot to do with it. And they wake up and they bring it to school. And a lot of times they don't know how to respond to what they're dealing with at home. And sometimes it's not even at home. It's just growing up as a teen. So,
as their teacher, you've got this mindset of being patient, creating these relationships, and then you do have these incidents where you're telling yourself not to take it personal. Patience, don't take it personal. Patience, don't take it personal. How difficult is that to keep those two separate? Because you're human too, and you have bad days. You had, a late night. Maybe you couldn't sleep the night before. You're not feeling well, and you mentioned earlier not being combative with them. That's got to be a delicate line to walk.
Very delicate, and in the beginning, it's a struggle because a lot of times, your students don't understand or realize that you're human as well. And I think over the course of time, instead of it being a situation where it's teacher versus students, an entire community is developed. So when we're all going through it, because again, it goes deeper than just me building relationships with the students, but trying to help them build relationships with each other. Although this particular student may not necessarily be your friend, we're all in this class, and this is our family, this is our community. And it's something that I always share with them. All represents one, and one represents all. So in regards to that delicate line, there have been days I'm having a bad day, and they'll pick up on it, and they'll learn not to take it personal, and then they'll make sure that I'm okay. Hey, Mr. Bridges, I see that today just wasn't your day, or something is bothering you, And then in some moments, if I'm getting frustrated and I'm trying my hardest not to let it show, some of my students will take the initiative to speak up to the class. Hey, Mr. Bridges is kind of having one of those days, y'all. Just make sure we don't do anything to kind of get under his skin or make matters worse. And I think it's like this. I'm blanking on the word that I want to use, but what I give to them, they give it right back. So there's this reciprocity, you could say.
Well, it's interesting so far. Some of the words you've used to describe how these relationships are created it is authentic, it's patience, it's not taking it personal, but it also sounds like it requires a lot of honesty on your part as well, being completely vulnerable with them, like what you were saying earlier, that you're a person too. You're not, you may be a teacher and this authoritative figure, but at the end of the day, you are going through the same things that we all are. How important is that raw honesty with your students in this environment to create these relationships?
100% important. And I try to be as transparent as possible when I'm addressing my scholars or talking to them. Whether it's about something on a personal level or just things going on in the community or in the world. It's all about being honest. And I think sometimes you can play it a little too safe. And again, playing it safe, you kind of work against yourself in regards to building those relationships. I honestly think sometimes playing it safe can be the most unsafe thing to do. But I think
when you say play it safe, what do you mean?
I think about some of the relationships that I've built with my students. And, you know, there are so many fine lines that you have to walk and navigate, because sometimes you don't want to cross any lines. You don't want to offend anyone. You don't want to offend the child. You don't want to offend their parents. You don't want to offend their beliefs and values. But sometimes you, in meeting students where they are, sometimes you have to take off the teacher hat. Hey, I'm your big brother now. I'm like your uncle. Let's talk. All right. And sometimes some people don't feel comfortable with taking off the teacher hat, and they're playing it safe. You know, I don't want to cross any lines or make people feel like I'm crossing boundaries, because you're just my teacher. You're not my father. You're not my dad. You're not my uncle. You're not my big brother. So that's just one example of what I mean by playing it too safe, because sometimes we get so wrapped up and consumed in just, I guess, what's right or wrong in the teacher world, or, you know, of course you respect the code of ethics, but I think sometimes we can take it a little too far, and it can be to our detriment, because, you know, it's all about building those relationships. So, perfect example, going to the park to play basketball with my students. Some people, some educators, some will say, that's inappropriate. You shouldn't be hanging with your students outside of class. But they're saying going to the park. Mr. Bridges showed up on the weekend to play basketball with us at the park. Oh man, you like the coolest teacher ever. And that sets us up to build those relationships. And we bring those relationships back to the classroom. And I think about that particular group of students that I'm referring to. One time I was teaching and my principal walked in and she just observed and she exited. And I received a text message from her saying that I saw those scholars and they're working so hard. And in all their years of being here, I've never witnessed them putting in the amount of work that they put inside of class. And, you know, as I reflected on, you know, her message to me, because again, I don't know what they did in their prior classes or previous classes. I realized that, you know, the reason why they were so willing to show up and put in the work had everything to do, or had a lot to do. I won't say it had everything to do, but it had a lot to do with me building those relationships with them outside of the classroom.
It's fascinating that you just hit on that, you know, taking your teacher hat off, being a person, fostering these relationships outside of the class. A couple years ago, I was in Louisiana making a video on one of our teachers in an urban environment. And one of the things he was talking about was, you know, more kids than not in his particular 7th grade math class, their dad wasn't around. It was just a one-parent home. That was just the majority of their class. And he was telling me, you know, we were supposed to be talking about math concepts, and somehow we got down a rabbit hole of talking just about his class. And one of the things he said that kind of struck me was going to his kids' basketball games, you could like visibly see them trying harder in his class. And he said, and you know, he kind of reminds me a lot of you. He was from that community. He really wanted to be a part of the community once he got out of college. And he said, you know, a lot of the kids at the beginning of the school year might have behavioral problems or not care about school. But if you're willing to be vulnerable with them, to your point, kind of take off that teacher hat and just be there for them, the amount of effort that they're willing to give in your classroom, it's not an instantaneous thing, but you can see a gradual improvement over time that,
Definitely,
you know, in a lot of these environments, and, you know, I don't want to speak for your class, but a lot of these environments, It might be a one person or a one parent household, and they're not used to someone being there for them. And to your point, playing basketball with them, to us, that seems like such a simple thing, but to kind of draw that line of what seems like a simple thing, playing basketball. I love basketball. And to me, that's just joy and passion and something I love to do. But when you're doing that with kids that might not have somebody in their life to simply play basketball with them, and you're hitting on it and he hit on it as well, it allows them to kind of get past these barriers that through no fault of their own they've put up just based on their current life situation that they have these barriers up. And it's not your fault. It's not their fault. They just exist because these are experiences that they've gone through. And, some of the things that you're talking about is breaking down some of these barriers.
And, everything that your colleague that you're referring to, everything that is true, just showing up and in ways in which they can see you in a different light, see you outside of just teacher, but as a role model or a mentor or a big brother or an uncle. And in some cases, a father figure. I always think about, on one occasion, I'm in class and I'm teaching. I'm immersed in my lesson and everything that I'm saying. And one of my scholars just randomly blurted out, "Hey, Mr. Bridges, you're like a father figure to us." I had to take a minute to pause because I think that was the first time when a student said that. I believe that was my first year teaching. And I think that moment gave me the confirmation that, man, you're doing the right thing. You're making an impact. But even further than that, you are more than a teacher to these students.
And that's one thing that I think urban schools, sometimes the students there get a bad rap unfairly.
Absolutely.
They're dealing with things that, 8th grade Scott would have never thought of.
Right.
And, for them to reference, to you as a father figure, that's probably 100% accurate for a lot of your kids. You start looking at some of the data or, some of the situations these kids are in, they are dealing with so much stuff before they ever get to Mr. Bridges' classroom. And for them to open up to you and be willing to learn, but also refer to you, as something as more than a teacher. I mean, that's a pretty big endorsement of you as a teacher making these efforts for these kids.
Yeah.
And I think that, that opportunity exists, and I don't want to say all kids, but most kids, that if you are willing to put in the effort, be authentic, be patient. And that's a lot to ask of a teacher, I know. Mm-hmm. But what comes out of it is really something beautiful. Because, I have no data or anything around this, but I'm willing to bet that, their 8th grade teacher believing in them, that might be the first or second or third time that someone has truly believed them in their lives. And that I think it's sad that, it's comes to this, but it's also really cool that it's their teacher that is believing in them.
That's very true. And it reminds me of something. I remember growing up and being inside of classes where the teacher would always say, "I have mine, get yours," referring to the education. And it never sat well with me, even as a child. You're here as an educator. Your job is to help me get mine. But because, some students were behavior problems and probably were dealing with those things at home and just bringing it to school, and you just didn't have it in you to take the time to pull them to the side just to have a conversation or understand that, hey, that student is a human as well. And I think at the end of the day, all I truly want to do, of course, I want to teach. Of course, I want to make a difference. And above all those things, I truly just want to inspire my students.
Thank you, Mr. Bridges. Thank you for a couple things. Thank you for what you do in your classroom. Thank you for taking some time to share some of the practices that you do in our classroom. I think it was interesting, some of the things you hit on were patience. These relationships take time, not taking things personal, not being combative with your students, being real with them, being authentic, but really just making the effort to invest in them personally and invest in their education. So thank you. I know this is helpful for a lot of people. And again, thank you for what you do in your classroom.